Eddie, your thoughts about what you just saw?
Nicole, I think we just saw the latest in a long line of public rituals of grieving. We have seen these funerals before. Three things came to mind as I watched the service: grief, faith, and hope. We have to deal with the fact that this family has to put George Floyd in the grave. And I kept thinking of 1 Corinthians 15, death, where is thy sting? Grave, where is thy victory? That we have to deal with the fact that they are confronting intimate loss. We can make George Floyd a symbol, but he was their brother, he was their uncle, he was their cousin, he was their family. And we'd have to deal with that fact. So I saw grief, and I also saw faith, that the way in which you grapple with the grave, the body in the coffin, has everything to do, at least in this context, with their belief in their tradition. We saw appeals to the Christian belief that death does not have the last word. And we saw it performed. We saw it, the fullness of the Black church in that service, which was beautiful. But, faith, when you think about Hebrews, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, which leads me to hope. That there is the hope that George Floyd's death, as Jonathan Capehart said earlier, his unwilling sacrifice will actually generate profound change. But then I was reminded of W.E.B. Du Bois's famous line in his elegy to his son in The Souls of Black Folk. He said, "Is a hope not unhopeful, but not hopeless, but unhopeful. A hope not hopeless, but unhopeful." It's a blues-soaked hope, with no guarantee that we will fundamentally transform this country. So there's a sense, Nicole, really quickly, of thinking about this ritual of grief that we've seen before, with its elements of grief, faith, and hope, against the backdrop of Donald Trump's talk that there's no systemic racism in American policing, the way in which they denied the reality of the problem in the country. That's the juxtaposition that's in my head as I try to grieve with the family today.
The juxtaposition is something in everybody's head thrust there by Donald Trump and his insistence on, he doesn't, hide the banana in this case. He has stood at the podium in front of his MAGA rallies telling everyone not to believe what they see with their eyes, not to believe what they hear with their ears, describing the press as fake news. So what do you think it says, Eddie, that 79% of Americans see it the way you see it, that this has shifted so quickly that never before have, in the eyes of, in the words of the Rev and others, have the marchers been so diverse in age, in race, in gender, and regional?
It suggests that we're on the precipice of some fundamental transformation. We stand at the crossroads, as I've said to you before. But there's no guarantee. The country is still deeply divided. James Baldwin was fond of saying, wasn't fond is the wrong verb. He said all the time, one of the most frustrating things about being Black in America is having to convince white people that what's happening to us is actually real. And so we see in real time Donald Trump denying the facts of the matter. And we see in real time his base believing him, thinking that this is just a one-off, that the reality of systemic racial bias in policing, that the depth of the problem in the criminal justice system is just simply us reveling or waddling in our victimhood, right? And so the challenge before us is still there. The murder of George Floyd didn't resolve the deep partisan divides. COVID-19 didn't end how those partisan divides play along the lines of racial divisions. Our country stands on a knife's edge, and we have to recognize that, even as we see a family grieve, rely on its faith, and hope and pray that the country will actually live up to the true meaning of its ideals and principles.
We're also joined by Alexi McCammon, political reporter for Axios, who stood on the knife's edge with three leaders on on the front lines of both crises that he touched on, coronavirus as well as the demonstrations, the peaceful ones, and in the earliest days, some of the ones that were out of control for a few moments in those earliest nights. Alexi, tell us what you heard from the leaders you interviewed.
Thank you for having me, Nicole. That's right. I spoke with Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms for our HBO show for Axios, and she really embodies this kind of competing power struggle that she has within her. She's, of course, the mayor of one of the great American cities, navigating Atlanta not just through the coronavirus, but through these protests that have really overtaken the country and the world in light of George Floyd's killing. But she's also a Black mother raising 4 Black children in America who recognizes that even though she holds a so-called position of power, she feels powerless in terms of keeping herself and her 4 children safe solely because of the color of their skin. And I just think that is a really fascinating dynamic to hear an elected official actually say out loud, because that's really what's underpinning all of this. No matter the shape of the protests or what people are saying or what they might not understand, it's that lived Black experience. Even when you achieve a position of power again, being elected as something like mayor, you still feel unsafe because of the racial divides and divisions in this country.
And it's something she talked about that first night when she went down, I think, near the CNN Center and said, "Go home." And she was speaking as a leader. She was speaking as a mother. This fear that she has articulated has also been articulated by Eddie, whose son has been protesting in New Jersey, by Michael Steele, whose kids were out protesting, by Maya Wiley, whose daughter has been protesting. Alexi, is there optimism that people can be made to understand it even if they don't live it?
You know, there is optimism, at least in some of the conversations that I've had, again, with Mayor Bottoms. I also got to interview Congresswoman Val Demings from Florida, Congressman Jim Clyburn, who said that what was different about this moment is that they feel that there is broader buy-in from not just Black folks, but from people of all stripes in a way that they just felt they haven't really had in the past. And I think that's a big part of trying to make change moving forward, is getting buy-in from all factions of the country, no matter what you look like or what you might not have understood before now. It's about really getting into understanding that experience. And I think part of getting to the optimism in the hope that people will understand, even if they haven't, is Mayor Bottoms sharing stories like she did, Maya Wiley sharing stories like she has, Eddie Glaude sharing stories like he has, Michael Steele and others, really educating Americans about what life is like for a lot of us when we're just trying to make it by like the rest of us.
Let me ask both of you one last question. Our colleague, the Rev Al Sharpton, I have sat moved to tears, at times laughter, but moved for all of his eulogies. The things he says stick in your head. You don't let them go. What do you think of the body of what he's had to sermonize this week? Tragedy, bluntness, straight talk. There are people here today that won't be here next week when the cameras are gone. And what role does he have in everything we've seen play out? Alexi first, then Eddie.
You know, I think that this moment, more than anything, calls for leadership, and not leadership in who can shut down the protests the fastest, but in leadership in who can navigate the competing crisis that the country is facing, crises, and not just the crises, but the competing emotions, as you alluded to, Nicole. We need someone who's going to be able to make sense of what's going on, but who's going to be able to offer words of hope that we can cling on to as we're trying to think of policy reforms and other things to move forward. So it's a critically important role to not only understand this as the Rev does from the inside out, but to understand the bigger picture of how we can move forward together.
And Eddie, something I think the Rev does masterfully is he what brings everybody into the conversation. There's no shaming people for their ignorance. There's just understanding, blunt, brutal honesty, and incredible sympathy and compassion for all the families. When he had all the families in that church today stand up, I mean, you'd have to have no heart to not be in tears seeing that spectacle.
Yeah, I mean, he's a preacher after all, and he has to have that capacity, you know what I mean? But I think in these sorts of moments, what we're trying, what's so desperately needed, Nicole, is language. How do we express the nature of our experience? You know, I'm always quoting Baldwin on your show, you know, for he has a line in The Fire Next Time that I'm paraphrasing.
Don't ever stop. Don't ever stop.
For the Negro experience, there's seldom a language that can account for it. You know what I mean? So what we need in this moment is somehow somebody to find the language to put in words what we're feeling, what has happened. And when we approximate it, there's a shift, there's a move at the gut, a possible shift in the center of gravity of one's moral orientation to the world. So Reverend Al's charge, our charge, is to reach for a language that can speak to the humanity of those who are witnessing from the outside.
Right.
So that they can actually access it and then hopefully move to change the world as we currently see it.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.